Let us now talk a bit more about how and why language changes. Language essentially changes in two ways. The first direction of change is diachronic. Language changes over time. That is why we need a translation when we read Beowulf and accent coaching if we want to perform Shakespeare in the English the bard spoke. Diachronic change is the subject of study in historical linguistics, and this is the type of change we will focus on in this course. The second change is synchronic. Variation in language exists simultaneously in different regions and social strata. That is why when you speak to an Australian or a Texan or a Scottish person or a Nigerian speaker of English, you think they have a quote-unquote accent, and they think you have an accent. And that is why you put your grocery bags in a trunk and a Londoner in her boot, and so on. Synchronic change is the subject of study in sociolinguistics. While we will focus on diachronic change in this course, we will nevertheless take a sociolinguistic approach to this study. We will study how English changed over time while looking at its dialects and the social factors that influenced the change. And speaking of the influential factors, they can be divided roughly into external and internal ones. External factors exist outside the boundaries of a given dialect. The influence of Norman French on Old English, for example, is an external influence. Internal factors exist inside dialect boundaries. For example, if a particular sound combination is easier to pronounce than another sound combination, the word that contains the latter may gradually change in pronunciation to the former. But it is important to remember that dialects have no clearly definable rigid boundaries. This applies both to synchronic and diachronic variation. English people did not wake up on the morning of October 15th, 1066, the day after the Battle of Hastings, and started speaking Middle English. All the processes of language change we will discuss in this course were gradual and slow, often taking decades and even centuries from start to the supposed finish, if such a finish can even exist. Remember, the English language is changing as we speak. It is in constant flux, like any other language in the world. So, let's briefly go over the external and internal factors affecting language variation. One of the most prominent external factors is geography. Dialects separated by geographical obstacles, such as rivers, mountains, and even oceans, often gradually diverge from one another as time goes by. In the meantime, coming into contact with other languages and dialects leads to the mutual adoption of the features of the languages and dialects in contact. One example here is the use in Indian English of the retroflex stops, t and d, in place of British alveolar stops, st and d. Retroflex stops are common in Indo-Aryan and Dravidian languages, which influence the English as it is spoken in India today. Social factors, including social class, gender, or literacy, technological developments, and so on, also affect language use and structure. Finally, imperfect learning can also lead to language change. This is how English came to lose all of its inflections, because people who spoke it were native speakers of French, and eventually their loss of inflection influenced how mainstream English, at that point Old English, was used. But language change can result from something going on in the language itself, not as a result of outside social or geographic phenomena. Ease of articulation is one such impetus for change. Some sounds may be easier to pronounce than others, so fluent speech may contain clipped forms, omitted syllables, and gradual change in sounds due to assimilation. Another factor is analogy. Analogy occurs when one word is formed or adjusted by analogy with other words. For example, the word intro was first used as a clipping of introduction in 1923. It was formed by clipping the full noun to its prefix, intro, which is of Latin origin and means inward or into. Intro is a complete prefix. It is not divided into in and tro. Intro is the whole morpheme. The word outro was formed by analogy with intro in 1967 to mean a concluding piece of a program or a concluding piece of music. There is no prefix outro, meaning outward. Word structures can be reanalyzed. The intro-outro pair is a good example. Intro was originally a whole prefix, not a combination of in and tro, as I mentioned before. Tro or ro is not a morpheme of any kind. However, the word was reanalyzed as a morpheme to form the word outro, where the out replaced only part of the prefix intro by reanalyzing it as in. Language internal factors can also be random. Sometimes things change just because. For example, nobody knows what caused the great vowel shift. After all, the sound eh is not any easier or harder to pronounce than the sound ah. And the sound I takes more effort, technically speaking, than the sound E. So the change shouldn't have happened from E to I, but it did. That's how vowels changed over the period of about 350 years from the mid-14th century to the early 18th century, for apparently no good reason. To recap, language change occurs along two dimensions. Variation that takes place over the course of time is called diachronic. Variation that exists simultaneously in different regions or social environments is called synchronic. But these are not two entirely separate types of variation. Social change, which is generally synchronic in nature, nevertheless affects diachronic changes in language. As some dialects gain prestige, for example, which is a social phenomenon, their features permeate other dialects and may even replace them over years and decades, which is a diachronic event. Language changes under the influence of some circumstances that exist outside of language, such as geography, social changes, societal structure, and even education. But it also changes due to happenings inside the language itself, such as change in sounds, morphology, and even syntax. We have discussed some, albeit certainly not all, factors in language change. Language change is natural, inevitable, and constant. In this class, we will examine how it affected English from the mid-5th century CE to the present day.